I'm the Youth Peace and Security focal point in PBSO. Very happy to be joining you today.
Great, thank you. Alejandro, maybe you would like to introduce yourself? Alejandro, we can't hear you yet. Let's see.
I'm so sorry. Good morning, everybody. Is this better, Ilva?
This is great, thank you.
Okay, thank you. Good morning, everybody. My name is Alejandro O'Neill. I am the monitoring and evaluation specialist at PBF, and I'm very glad to be joining you today and talking about how to go from a concept node to a project in this GYPI call for proposals this year.
Great, thank you so much. Shasa, would you like to introduce yourself as well?
Good morning, everyone. I'm Shaza Sulaiman, and I'm the Gender Advisor with the Peace Building Support Office. Nice to meet everyone.
Thank you so much. And Emmanuel, would you like to introduce yourself as well?
Hello, everyone. I'm Emmanuel Bernard. I'm Program Officer at the PBF based in New York. Nice to be with you today.
Great, thank you so much. Okay, then Alejandro, I think we're ready for the next slide. So this is a brief overview of what we will be covering today. So first, a little bit on the GYPI timeline of stage 2, and then we'll dive into conflict analysis, including conflict sensitivity, M&E and results framework, and then project analysis. Okay, and then in the end, of course, also questions and answers. And we're thinking that we'll pause the presentation after each section to allow for a bit of questions and answer after that section. And then in the end, there will also be questions and answers. Okay, great. And then we're ready for the next slide. Thank you. Yes, so first of all, congratulations on your proposal making it to stage 2 of the GYPI. We're very happy to have all of you here. Just briefly in terms of the timeline of next steps, as you know, September 17th is the deadline for CSO to provide documents of prevention of sexual exploitation and abuse. And it's also the deadline to send draft proposals for feedback, which is optional. And the next deadline to keep in mind is October 22nd, which is the deadline for submissions of full project proposals. And late submissions will not be accepted. So please keep this in mind. Great. I think that is all from me. Let me hand over to Alejandro.
Again, good morning, good evening, and good afternoon to everybody. I hope everybody is doing well and healthy. Thank you, Ova, for this introduction. And basically, what we'll be touching upon today is how to go from the concept node stage to a more project definition state, project design stage, and also because we are talking about this GYPI call for proposals, we want to make sure that we have 3 elements in mind when we are creating our projects from now on continuing in the different stages. First, that we are, of course, gender sensitive to every single one of our projects that we are designing. 2, that we are youth sensitive to them. And 3, that we implement or that we take into account a very clear peace building approach into our project designs from the very, very beginning. So this being said, we can start saying that our journey has started already. It started with a concept node stage, but also it started with defining and the most crucial, most important element of our project design, which is our conflict analysis. Our conflict analysis will depict and tell us what are those underlying assumptions, what are those conflict drivers that we want to address, and what are the characteristics of the societies, of the populations, of the communities that we want to work with in the future while implementing our programs and projects. It is important to note that our conflict analysis will tell us something about the current situation, what is happening, but it's also very well related to the project that we're trying to design. It will depict the conflict drivers, and of course, it will tell us what are the stakeholders, the different actors that are around the different conflicts that we are seeing on the ground, and how they interact between one another. After that, after we have created our conflict analysis, of course, being conflict sensitive and gender sensitive and youth sensitive in this drafting of this document, we will start thinking about creating a results framework, and most importantly, we need to start thinking about creating our theories of change. Those theories of change will also be related to our conflict analysis and to our results framework by the definition of that desired change that we're seeking in the societies that we want to intervene. Desired change meaning a behavioral or institutional change that we will try to promote with our interventions in order to definitely diminish the amount of conflictivity, or the amount of violence that there is in a specific community or population that we want to work with in the future. In that sense, when we think about the desired change, we need to think about what is the difference between the current situation and that future situation that we're envisioning. What are the different elements that we want to touch upon, and how we want to touch upon them. And we want to think also about what are those peace building needs that there are, on one hand, explicit in our conflict analysis while being conflict sensitive, and that we are able as organizations to actually work with to definitely build up on these desired changes. Finally, we want to think about what is the strategic space for a peace building intervention. The strategic space meaning socially, a space within our societies that we want to intervene, geographically, so certain communities in certain areas in certain specific municipalities, departments, states, provinces, etc. And also within the actors, what are the actors, the space within those where those actors are interacting, for us to foresee or push or promote that desired change. This is the stage where we're going to define our monitoring and evaluation frameworks that will in the end give us the ability to be accountable towards both the donor and the communities that we're serving. What is a conflict analysis? A conflict analysis, again, is our starting point. Our conflict analysis will definitely describe what is the situation on the ground, but also will describe what is the situation on the specific issue that we want to address with our project. It will tell us where to deliver impacts geographically, what is the space where we want to deliver those impacts. It will tell us how to deliver those impacts, because the conflict analysis would also seeks for us to be introspective and think about our own organizations and say, how can we, is our expertise, what is our experience in specific thematics, and how we can deliver those impacts while using that expertise, internal expertise and internal even mandates, for instance, for our UN agencies, sponsored programs, etc., to deliver those impacts. And finally, it is the basis for our quality programming. Why? Because it tells us what is the conflict, what is the interaction that there is between people, what is between communities, between actors, stakeholders, etc. A bad conflict analysis, a conflict analysis that will not serve us well, is a conflict analysis that is too general, that it only describes maybe the historical situation, that only centers on a specific aspect, or in too many aspects that are not relevant to our project or to our intervention. A bad conflict analysis, unfortunately, is, on the other hand, too detailed on the very nitty-gritty specifics, not necessarily touching upon, the peace-building needs of the community that we want to serve. A bad conflict analysis, unfortunately, is also one that is not up to date. When we use data, for instance, that is more than 5 or 6 or 10 years old, unfortunately, that conflict analysis will not serve the purposes that we're seeking for. A bad conflict analysis is skewed or limited. It only touches upon or either is too general and it doesn't serve the purpose of the project, or is too detailed and will not tell us the specifics of our own abilities to impact those communities. A bad conflict analysis does not justify the planned activities, and this is very important because our conflict analysis needs to be very well intertwined, interconnected, and related to the activities that we're planning in the future. And a bad conflict analysis will only tell us a list of factors, facts, or even actors that are within the space that we want to intervene. On the other hand, if we talk about good conflict analysis, what do they contain? They contain, on one hand, those conflict factors and indexes that describe the characteristics and places where we want to intervene. Again, not being too general, but also not being too detailed, to a certain extent, serving the purposes of the project. It has an analysis that is project specific, meaning it touches upon those elements that we are experts on, but also that we see are happening in the communities that we want to serve. It is pertinent to the project because it depicts what the thematic focus of our project. In this case, for instance, for the GYPI call for proposals, we want to have the gender and youth promotion aspect very well described in our conflict analysis. It tells us information about region disaggregated data, differentiated analysis, dynamics that are happening, the relationships between the different stakeholders and actors within the landscape that we want to intervene. It definitely touches upon the key stakeholders and analyze those stakeholders, those actors. We want to know how are the interactions between those different actors on the ground and our own interactions also with those actors on the ground. Our interactions, if we're a UN agency funded program, our interactions with the government, for instance, with the local governments. How are the local governments related to the national government, etc. So a great array of stakeholder analysis can be made in our conflict analysis, but it's also very important because it would also depict the different conflicts that appear between those interactions. Finally, a good conflict analysis will address biases. Specifically, it must be, in this case, taking into account an analysis on the gender perspective and the youth perspectives in the spaces where we want to intervene. And the conflict analysis is concise and its drafting is very well structured, meaning it presents the information in a prioritized manner. Say, this is the most important thing that we want to see intervene. This is the interactions that we're seeing. These are the conflicts that we are perceiving happening in these spaces, and this is the drafting and how concise we are in it will put us in that middle place between being too general and too detailed. It is very much important to be fact-based when we're drafting our conflict analysis, and we need to be using the most sources as we can, the most information, external, being secondary information, being surveys, being all the different data that we know that we have because we are working in those communities, we are working in those spaces, being very rigorous in the use of data and information while also drafting our conflict analysis. But also, we definitely want to be conflict sensitive. And this is where the peace building approach comes in, and the peace building lens comes in, because we want to be using the conflict sensitivity of our organization to describe what is happening, but also to position our organization as a key actor that can actually impact a community in a positive way. In that sense, we want to see the conflict sensitivity in every single aspect of the documents that we're writing, but also in the implementation of our programs. Conflict sensitivity is our ability as organizations to understand that context where we operate. In our conflict analysis, we are portraying the way we understand that context and how we position ourselves as organizations to impact those contexts. It also is our ability to understand those interactions between the intervention that we're planning and the context that we say we understand, right? And finally, we act. Our past actions and our future actions are based precisely in this understanding of this interaction between the intervention and the context. And while acting, we are minimizing any negative effects that can be in relation to conflict or escalation of violence, and maximize those effects in terms of behavioral and institutional changes that we're seeking for in order to diminish conflict, to diminish violent interactions, and to put in place potentially negotiated solutions to these conflicts that we are perceiving in the societies that we want to serve. We also work in a do no harm, or within the do no harm approach, which is basically whatever we do, the money that we're putting into the societies that we're serving, the money that we're putting into the spaces that we want to intervene, is used not to aggravate or exacerbate conflict, but to diminish and put in place conflict resolution measures to diminish again those conflicts and diminish against those escalations, possible or probable escalations of violence. And finally, we are managing our risks in the best way possible. We're asking ourselves what can go wrong since the very beginning, and how can we solve it from the very beginning. In that sense, within the project lifecycle, we want to see this conflict sensitivity. We want to be conflict sensitive, not only in this design stage where we are right now, but also while implementing, but also while monitoring and evaluating our programs. We want to be conflict sensitive, and this will, again, portray or put us within the peace building sphere where we want to work, right? In the design of a project, of course, we're being conflict sensitive while drafting our conflict analysis, while drafting our risk analysis, while understanding the interactions between actors and stakeholders. But also, we reflect when designing our programs on what effects can our recruitment make in conflicts that are happening on the ground. Are we maybe potentially messing with power dynamics between communities if we recruit one person or the other, or this profile, or this other? In the same way, how we select our beneficiaries. If we're, for instance, working in a community that has a large refugee population, are we only targeting refugees, but also and not targeting maybe host communities living one community on the side? So we need to be conflict sensitive in that way, while selecting our implementing partners, while understanding the local structures, how they work, how they interact between each other, being communities, local structures, being local governments, national governments. What are those interactions? We need to be conflict sensitive and understand if those interactions will do more harm or not if we intervene, etc. And finally, we need to understand what are the potential spoilers to our interventions, meaning those elements that will potentially go wrong and make us do more harm, and maybe make us have a negative effect in the communities that we're trying to serve. During the implementation, we need to be conflict sensitive in the way that we need to mitigate security risks for us and the people that work with us, but we also need to mitigate any risk that the beneficiaries are having and risks, especially of going back into escalated levels of conflict, of violence. We want to be mitigating risks related to corruption and misusage of funds. And finally, we need to be very conflict sensitive when coordinating between stakeholders, not only our stakeholders as organizations, but the stakeholders of the project and stakeholders present in that landscape that we're trying to intervene. And finally, while both designing and implementing our monitoring strategy, and in the end, when evaluating our project, we need to be conflict sensitive in the sense that we need to be updating constantly our conflict analysis. Why? Because the contexts where we work are very dynamic, are very diverse, are very prone to change constantly. We need to be updating our conflict analysis. Secondly, we need to be creating tracking tools that actually tell us what the impact that the impact of what we're doing is in the landscape that we're intervening, being this positive or negative impact, because both things can happen. We need to be adaptable in the sense that when new data is coming to us, when new information is coming to us, say a new conflict analysis, a new element, a certain change in our context, we need to be able to adapt our project into that change. One shock that we can use as an example here is COVID and the pandemic, how it changed the way we're implementing in 2020 most of our peacebuilding programming around the world. And finally, we need to, when defining our evaluations and working with the external evaluators who want to promote including conflict-sensitive questions in the way we evaluate our projects, in the sense that they understand what are the dynamics that are happening, what are those conflict drivers that we were trying to intervene, but also if anything within our context has changed, potentially doing a little bit of harm to our project, to the communities that we're serving, or on the other hand, diminishing the level of conflict or the level of violence in certain societies.
And I'm going to jump right in. Thanks, Alejandro, so far. So I want to just specifically talk a little bit about the gender and youth sensitivity when we're doing a conflict analysis. And we have, of course, this is not extensive, but just some tips and some things to keep in mind, particularly in the context of the GYPI project. So it's important to include a comprehensive gender and youth sensitive conflict analysis. By this, we mean highlighting the gender and age dynamics that are at stake, at the context and the causes, the dynamics, and the resolution of the conflict, and analyze how how women, men, girls, boys experience conflict differently, and try to explain how their situation, their roles, and their responsibilities have both been impacted by the conflict, have been involved in the conflict, and also how they contribute to the resolution. Another thing that is important is to ensure that the term gender is not used just to equate women. And very similarly, that when we talk about youth, we're just not talking about young men. So being very mindful when we're putting our analysis. Also being very much aware that gender intersects with age, class, race, sexual orientation, and many other identities. And so reproducing a range of masculinities and femininities. Therefore, it's important to pay attention on the variations to those specific roles and the experiences and needs that are different for women, men, girls, boys, etc. Consider gender sensitivity beyond just this women and men dynamics, and also be age sensitivity, sensitive to age beyond this youth and adults divide. Also try to be as specific as possible and acknowledge the diversity of identities and the conflict and peace building roles that women, men, girls, and boys all have in specific contexts. And finally, considering the process, try to really employ a participatory approach, making sure that there is meaningful engagement of the key stakeholders, specifically women, youth, but also other vulnerable groups and youth organizations, women's groups, women's organizations, etc. I'm going to ask my colleagues, Shaza and Ilva, if I forgot anything before heading back to Alejandro.
I just wanted to thank you very much. I just wanted to add something, maybe just to elaborate on the part on the masculinities and femininities, and I think looking beyond our biases of what the role women usually occupy and what usually what role men usually play. So, for example, women are not constantly victims in these conflict settings, and young men are not always a risk or a potential risk for, or have a potential risk towards against peace building. So these are the kind of things and the kind of biases that you kind of in a conflict analysis also hope to avoid. The other thing is also just making sure that, when during a conflict analysis, as yes, they need to be gender responsive, they need to be, looking at youth factors, but at the end of the day, the conflict and peace building variables also need to be clear. It is at the end of the day a peace building project, not a women's empowerment project and not a youth empowerment project, but these are projects that need to also contribute to peace building. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Shasa. And then just, Alejandro, if you can move to the next slide, just to let you know, as we share, we're going to share those slides, but there are a few examples of conflict analysis that you can use to have a better sense of what we mean. So we will share a few examples when we share the slides. Thank you. Over to you, Alejandro.
Thank you so much, Joan Shasa. I want to pause here and maybe address some of the questions that we might have so far in relation to conflict analysis and conflict sensitivity, and give it up to Emmanuel to help us moderate a little bit these questions, if there are some.
Yes, thanks, Alejandro. Yes, absolutely. So please, colleagues, let us know in the chat in English, French, or Spanish if there are any specific questions or comments on this session. There's already one comment that we received from Unsum, I believe, which was a very useful comment indeed about, how realistic can we be or do we need to be when we try to undertake these conflict analyses processes, which can be extremely, labor intensive, time consuming, and complex. And how realistic is it to be able to invest all of this to develop, one or a few 18-month projects, I think is the gist of the comment. And I think that's a really good point to discuss. I mean, I would like to first bring it back to the GYPI, which is, the session today, a kind reminder to colleagues is to really help you develop viable projects. I mean, you made it through the first round of pre-selection, and it's really about kind of guiding the way that you will write the project documents that you will submit very soon, right, by 17th of September. So it's really, pragmatically about making sure that you strengthen, you have the tools to give like a conflict analysis that is as useful as possible. I like to use the term useful because for me, it's a good practical replacement of the word good. It's really as good. The conflict analysis is going to be really as good as it is useful to really design an effective peace building project with, impact, with results, with impact, and with, making sure that these things are measurable. So for me, that's that. And then in terms of, Morit's comments, for us, again, so going back to the idea of usefulness, the investment in the conflict analysis process is a requirement. We must have that. So the agencies, funds, and programs and entities applying to PBF funding, this is the peace building fund. So the investment must be made. We do hear very often that it takes a lot of time and it's really laborious, it's really difficult, but that's the way you're going to do a peace building project. So one thing that we try to do, and there's resources in the system, I'll post in the chat maybe right now one even a link to a conflict analysis guidance, and our colleague from Somalia was also talking about developing a practical guidance. We need more and more of these for sure to increase the capacities within the system to do conflict analyses, and for us to learn to leverage those things. You're not supposed to, in principle, in an ideal world, let's say, you're not starting a conflict analysis from scratch when it's time to apply to the one PBF project that you want to do, right? This is something you use resources, analyses that have been ongoing for years in these conflict or prevention settings. You pull resources across various agencies that have done research studies, that have operations on the ground, already contact with on the ground with communities, with local authorities. So all these things are present on the ground, current, and from the past is supposed to enable us to have the resources to, if not speed up, at least have the basic tools that we need to complete those analyses without starting entirely from scratch. And then the other thing, in addition to conflict analysis being difficult and complex, but still required, it's even more difficult to do a youth-sensitive and gender-sensitive analysis. So That's for that. You'll see the link in the chat to a little bit of a UN practice note on conflict analyses. There's also a variety of methodologies, right? A variety of approaches and a variety of abilities of depths to do analysis. But keep in mind what is the most useful aspect of this for your project, and be sort of practical with that. Any other comments or questions? And again, you can do this in Spanish, French, or English as you wish in the chat. Any other question on sort of the key key aspects that Alejandro talked about? Like one that comes to mind, for example, because we have another 5-6 minutes to talk during this Q&A for this session. One point that comes to mind for me that I'd like to reemphasize, because this is something that is particularly difficult to do in a succinct and useful way in project documents, is when we talk about stakeholder analysis, and really identifying, so what is the relationship between the key stakeholders that you identify and the conflict? What is their role? What are their various roles? Sometimes the same stakeholder can be a contributor, participant to the conflict, is also the stakeholder who can have a peace building, who can be a peace building agent. So there's multiple roles that stakeholders play at community level, at national level, depending on which conflict dynamic you're talking about. So it can be a fairly complex thing. So does anybody have any question when you're going to write your project document in the next couple of days? Continue to write it. Do you have any questions as to how to go about doing that? Or do you have any questions about why is this important, in the sense that obviously, like Alejandro explained, the reason why we need to see this is because then when we examine the theory of change that you will develop, when we examine the outcomes, outputs, and activities that you propose, these need to be directly linked to the stakeholders that you've identified. The activities, the behavior that you're trying to change in the stakeholders need to be directly linked to what you will have said in the analysis about their role in the conflict, right? So this is how the PAC will also review your project proposals and evaluate them and approve them or not. It'll be when we read the description of a given activity, can we trace it directly to the given output, directly to the given outcome, and directly to the way that you've analyzed the behavior of the stakeholders. If you're saying that and it's all interlinked, obviously, because I think of Shaz's comment as well, which is absolutely essential, right? If you're saying that, I recently read a project that talked about, part of the factors of insecurity in this community, part of the factors of conflict is growing insecurity in this area. Part of the factors of insecurity is idle youth. So, this is not ideal as a piece of conflict analysis, right? We want to hear, how is idle, how are the quote unquote idle youth contributed to conflict? What are the motivations? It's not, oftentimes it's not just young men equals, potential for conflict. It needs to be further explained. What are the dynamics? Why is there a call for, there's a new message. I'm going to monitor if there's any questions. So just to finish on this, it needs to be further explained. The behaviors need to be detailed a little bit further, then the activities need to address that directly and be youth and gender sensitive. There's a question about how are indigenous mediation or conflict resolution practices considered into this method. So do you mean so in the analysis parts, or in sort of the tools of mediation that we pick? Are you talking about sort of locally owned grassroots mediation tools? That's absolutely important. It's a very good point. It's something that we encourage seeing in our projects, because something that is what we know, and that is crucial for the PBF, is to make sure that the solutions are homegrown and locally owned, right, in order to ensure effectiveness. So you're right that in the analysis, if this is something, the more granular the analysis at community level, the more specifically you will have identified, the key factors of conflict in the community. So if you're talking about in a community where there's tensions between the traditional power structure and the state power structure, for example, then you want to look at, how to address those tensions through dialogue mechanisms that are inclusive of both local authorities, state administration, and traditional leadership. Then then this is an aspect where you can look at then traditional conflict resolution mechanisms. But we can talk about that more, and colleagues can jump in if you have more examples of really indigenous mediation and conflict resolution practices. There's another question that I can't read this, from Raquel. Hi, Raquel, how are you? The CDA tool provides guidance on conducting conflict analysis and applying the findings of analysis for a range of purposes. So Raquel, you're explaining what the CDA is and how useful it is. Agreed. Thank you for that. So yes, mediation tools. So we'll talk, in terms of, we'll talk about that a little bit more in the final Q&A section, because I think let's focus here on the analysis, because you're looking at the mediation tools at the later stage. First, you analyze what the conflict dynamics are that you wanna address, and this is what we're looking at here in this section. Another thing that Alejandro pointed to is the importance of being clear and well structured in the analysis. That's another reminder as you write your project document. So it shouldn't be a potpourri of, sometimes we see this, the main factors are, and then a long list of things. It needs to really be well structured so that we can understand the dynamics. I mean, again, this is not about describing, it's about analyzing the causes, the cause and effects, and the relationship between these factors, the relationships between the stakeholders, so that we can then address them properly. Anything else? Also from colleagues who are facilitating and presenting, please jump in as you see fit. We have, 2 more minutes, Ilva?
Something like that. Yeah, one thing. There is also a question about what content the draft for revision should include. And just to quickly answer that we recommend you use the products also for the drafts. And there's no, there's no decision set on which sections we would like to see or anything like that. I think it's up to project teams. And of course, the more developed the draft is already by that deadline, the better basis we will have to provide useful feedback. But we recommend that you use the products for this. I hope this helps to answer that question.
Thanks, Ilva. 2 more questions. One, very quickly on what's the difference between stakeholders and actors? That's a really good question. Stakeholder is a little bit broader. Stakeholder, we're talking about all the parties. It's, both, let's say the armed groups, the security, state security forces, the local administration, the local communities, the various subsections in the local communities that you'll identify that are pertinent to your analysis, young people, women, of a certain, ethnic group, of a certain religious community, of a certain, so the categories depend on your analysis of the conflict and its dynamics, right? So the stakeholders are everyone, the national authorities, the partners, the, future project beneficiaries. So it's broader. The actors in the conflict analysis, you're talking about those who are, taking action in the dynamics. So it can be in very different ways. It can be the actors of the conflict, the ones that are carrying arms and, carrying out violence. And these can be multiple actors, particularly in complex settings. You have, it's from the formal armed group, the security forces, to the more informal self-defense forces, to the, people, engaging in criminal activity. So it's a very broad group, but it's really those. So you have those. You also have the actors, maybe, who are more actors of change and peace building. It can be members of civil society, human rights activists, that are trying to help build the protection and the resilience of communities. So it's, the two terms are then de facto often used, interchangeably, but it's a much stronger analysis if you sort of differentiate between the two, and again use that idea of what's most useful. Stakeholders, include partners, international partners, donors. So it's really the whole range. Whereas the actors, it's closer to the action of the conflict factors you're talking about on the ground. There's another comment from Willem, and maybe we'll end on this. And if you have other questions that come up or other comments that come up, we have another Q&A at the end of the session today. How do you envision conflict analysis to deal with contexts in which there are many different driving factors behind conflicts in communities that might be intertwined, but cannot all be addressed in an 18-month project? That's an excellent point. I think, and this sometimes is confusing, and that's, I think, going back to the presentation, which we're talking about, we don't want an analysis that is too large, too broad, but we don't want an analysis that is too specific to community. So we want the right scale. And again, it's usefulness. So indeed, you're not in Somalia in one given project going to address all of the conflict dynamics. You zero in on the ones that you understand that you want to address in the project. So you give kind of an overall introduction, then you focus on the 3 or 4 relevant conflict dynamics for the project's intervention, right? You can't cover everything. But the 4 that you identify, you really explain them clearly and well and delve into this. And then you zero in on the stakeholders, actors, dynamics that are pertinent to those 4. You don't do like a fully comprehensive national level analysis or fully comprehensive even in the community. You give like a chapeau, and then you zero in on the 3-4 driving factors that you are aiming to address here in this project. That's absolutely fine.
Also, to complement Emmanuel, and before we move on to the next stage, I would say that that this narrowing down of analysis, it also is linked to the expertise that I have as an organization. Say, if I am an organization that can do say mental psychosocial support, I will not be developing analysis on conflict drivers or factors that are not related to what I can do. So that also helps you narrow down a little bit, that analysis and the way that we depict that information to be in line to what we're proposing, to the different activities, results, objectives, etc., that we will develop in the next stage. Thank you, Manuel.
Yeah, I mean, just maybe on this as well, just to complement, I mean, most of these projects are joint projects, right? Or all of them. So or most of them. So you do want to leverage kind of your respective value added and your respective expertise, because while, what Alejandro has absolutely said is absolutely correct, we also want to see a peace building project that is not the regular programming that you would have done under your organization, right? So it's a balance to find. So yes, use your expertise, but also make sure that this is not the same as if you were doing your regular programming under your agency. The value added is that you leverage the synergies with the expertise of the others, and you do a more kind of bigger picture, holistic analysis as well. It's a bit of a balance to find. Let me end here so we can move to the rest of the presentation.
Thank you very much, Manuel. And yes, so moving on, we will talk now a little bit about defining, drafting our results frameworks, and specifically how we are to address the issues of monitoring and evaluation within our peace building GYPI projects, that we are trying to draft for this next stage in the call for proposals. And I might be going back to the basics of the basic definitions that we have, but definitely it is pertinent for us today to remind ourselves that when we talk about monitoring, we're talking about systematic data collection that puts together a selection of indicators that will allow us as implementers and the different stakeholders, meaning donors or other in-country stakeholders, to have information on how we are using the money that we've been given, what is the progress that we're having in implementing the activities that we said we were going to implement, and also what are the chances that we might actually achieve those goals that we set to ourselves while defining the project. So it is important to know that the monitoring process is a systematic data collection, and it needs to start in the very, very, very beginning, and it's to be embedded into our designing of our project. And also, again, going a little bit back to basics, we need to remind ourselves that the evaluation process determines the interest, the value, or the usefulness of our project. In that sense, it is also a systematic assessment, but also very objective in the sense that in our case, and this is a PBF requirement, it is an independent evaluation that we do by the end of our projects. But also it is an assessment that will, in the end, give us an understanding of what the results were, right? Did we do harm or not? Did we achieve our goals or not? Were we able to intervene those conflict factors that we said we were trying to intervene? And finally, to depict a little bit those behavioral and institutional changes that we're seeking in terms of peace building. The evaluation in the end must provide credible and useful information that depicts lessons learned that inform the decision making in the future. So while the monitoring will inform our decision making while implementing our programs, the evaluation will give us data and information and value added to the decision making processes of the future. We can, of course, do evaluation during the implementation. That's a different kind of evaluation but for the purposes of today, we will definitely assume, because of the PBF requirements, that our evaluations will be done by the end of our projects. And I want to stop here before going back to the theoretical process to talk to you a little bit about what are the PBF expectations in terms of monitoring and evaluation. What is PBSO expecting of you as fund recipients, being UN agencies sponsored programs or international NGOs or civil society organizations? We expect for you to be the main responsible entity of both monitoring and evaluation of the projects that we are investing in. 2, we are expecting for you to develop very solid results frameworks. And we will go a little bit more in depth into what a results framework is and why is it different from a theory of change. We are expecting that you do a timely baseline data collection, and that's why I'm saying that I am insisting in the fact that the monitoring process must be embedded into our project designs since the very, very beginning, and we need to foresee the gathering of the baseline data from the very beginning. Unfortunately, in the past, we have had fund recipients who gather, baseline data 1 year after starting implementation of the program, and that, in terms of monitoring and evaluation, is not pertinent, and it's not related to what we expect, what we as PBF expect of you as fund recipients. We expect you to be able to use different and differentiated data sources, and also to be able to use mixed methods when gathering data. In data sources, we also include, secondary data sources, primary data sources, qualitative information, and qualitative data is also very important for us to gather, but also we expect you to be able to do that as well, to gather that type of data. This data is actually used, not just gathered and analyzed, but actually used in terms of helping projects being adaptable and to learn from that data that is being gathered, and to learn from the implementation and learn while doing a little bit. We also expect for you to be able to document any change that there is either in the context where we're operating or any change that you're proposing to have to our project structure, if necessary, due to those changes in the context. Finally, we expect you to do an external independent evaluation by the end of your project. So finalizing this 18 months, we expect an independent external evaluation, but also we expect that in your budgets that you reserve from between 5 to 7% of your budgets to be dedicated exclusively for monitoring and evaluation purposes, meaning baseline data collection, meaning monitoring throughout the implementation phase of your project, but also for evaluation. In that sense, we are at the moment where we have already defined what is our conflict analysis. We have already analyzed the context where we want to operate. We've analyzed ourselves internally as well, knowing what is the benefit of us trying to intervene in a specific aspect or a specific conflict driver, or to push for a specific behavioral institutional change. Then it is time for us to define how we are going to measure the achievement of these goals, right? We define, of course, the first thing we define is our results. What will be our results in the future? What will be the outcome of the activities? What will be the outcome of the activities that we're implementing, but also what is the input that we're giving as organizations for those outcomes to be present in the societies that we're serving. In that sense, we are to define what are the indicators that we're going to be measuring, right? The indicators that we're going to be measuring throughout the implementation of a project, and that will help us to, one, be adaptable to any changes in the environment, and will help us to learn and maybe change or adapt our program or our project if necessary to those changes in the environment. It is important that indicators, and I want to emphasize a little bit in indicators here, the fact that indicators must tell us, on one hand, how much we have done, how many activities we have done, but also what are those behavioral and institutional changes. If we are expecting those to appear, what are those and how we can measure those, right? Indicators, we expect them to be simple, analysis-oriented, measurable. They can be quantitative, qualitative, but also they can depict perceptions, number of actions, number of people served, number of actions, perceptions, facts, opinions, and of course, we expect some of those indicators to be also, operational measurements. How many of these activities we have done, how much of this how many people have benefited from learning in this or this other activity. And finally, we will define what are our data sources, right? Where is this information coming from and how we're gathering it? Here it is important for us to be clear as project designers. What is the frequency of the data collection, right? Both in monitoring and potentially evaluation if possible, but not necessarily. And how we will try and analyze this information, this data, once it's gathered. The frequency is quite important because if we choose to gather data on a very short period of time, maybe we will not be able to see the effects of the impacts or the effects of the results or any changes, behavioral institutional changes in the societies that we're serving. Maybe if we put a larger span of time between one data collection and the other, say the baseline and say a midterm data collection, then we might see those changes between when we did the conflict analysis, so the current situation, and after we have started intervening this society. In the plan also, we need to define what are the monitoring responsibilities. We understand that, for instance, like this, the responsibilities that we assign within our organizations will come or be assigned in the future once the projects are approved and we received our funding and etc. But also if we can prepare a little bit beforehand and say, these are our M&E responsibilities. This will be the person, or this will be the profile of or the resource where that of a person gathering data in this and this and this time in moment in time, etc. It'll be great, and it will show that your project is way better structured. And also, of course, and as I was mentioning, we need to plan from the very beginning the M&E budget. Important to know, of course, that the budget needs to be also gender sensitive and also youth sensitive in this when related also to monitoring and evaluation. I want to hand it over to Ilva here.
Yes, thank you so much, Alejandro. So we also wanted to share some tips in terms of gender and youth considerations for M&E. So one thing that's important is that monitoring and evaluations need to be gender and age sensitive, as Alejandro was just saying. And it's important then to ensure that the evaluators have gender and age expertise and that the TOR have detailed gender and age considerations in order to make this happen. So that's a tip that we wanted to share. Another thing we wanted to mention is that for all people-related data and indicators, they need to be disaggregated by gender and age. And in case this is not possible, a justification needs to be provided. Further, we also want to highlight that working with beneficiaries and key stakeholders, such as women and youth, in designing the M&E framework can help identifying what needs to be measured and heightens the project's transparency and accountability. So that's also a very important point. And lastly, also, monitoring should include specific sources on gender and youth relevant information to make sure it is gender and youth sensitive. Joao or Shaza, did I miss anything? Would you like to add anything? If not, I think we can. Yeah, go ahead, Shaza.
No, I just wanted to say nothing from my side. Yeah, that's. I don't know if Joel has anything.
If
no,
not,
nothing on my side. Sorry.
Oh, no worries. Okay, great. Thank you, Alejandro. Over to you.
Thank you so much. Now I want to pause here for a minute and see if we have any questions in regards to defining our monitoring and evaluation frameworks and how we can be gender sensitive and peace building sensitive, conflict sensitive to our monitoring and evaluation frameworks. I see an initial question from Sheila about funding being a gap in terms of real-time baseline data collection and how we can mitigate this. And that sometimes the capacities of institutions in terms of data collection and storage is a challenge to gather real-time data. To be honest, Sheila, we expect that it is within the definition of your projects that you address these risks. We understand, of course, that there is a gap in terms of sometimes in terms of capacities of actual capacities on the ground to gather data on real time, but we can also plan given the capacities that we have as organizations, given the capacities that we have in these joint programs, maybe that add, value added that Manuel was mentioning a couple of minutes ago, that each organization brings can help us mitigate those issues. And in terms of funding, of course, if we budget from the very beginning that between 5 to 7% of our budget needs to be dedicated exclusively to monitoring and evaluation, then we expect that in the first tranche or in the first stages of our implementation process, we have already defined how we're going to gather this baseline data, how we're going to accelerate the hiring processes for the people who are doing our monitoring and evaluation, and so on and so forth. So in the end, it will be we expect that since this is the responsibility of the fund recipients, we expect that somewhat these challenges are also mentioned and addressed in the definition in your products, etc. As Joao is saying, please feel free to use the chat to ask questions in either English, French, or Spanish.
Great, thank you so much. Unless there are any other questions or any more comments from colleagues here helping to present, I think we can also move forward. Let's see.
Ilva, if I may, I want to maybe jump in very quickly on this and also maybe share kind of a hopefully useful point of experience. When it comes to M&E, I think I want to, one way to summarize this as well is just you need to be really thoughtful about it, right? So if there's issues in terms of accessing or being able to collect data, and some of the contexts that we're working in, it's a real issue, it really depends, but in some areas that are, hard to reach, and when we're trying to do something new in a new context, the data collection can be a little, or the baselines can be a little bit difficult, or it's like when access is complicated and when resources are not there, when there's a variety, but so that's okay as long as you explain this and describe the lack quite well in the project document. So the only problem is you just don't sort of think it through and present it in a clear way in the project document. Then it feels like there's an issue with the M&E on this design of this project, so we can't go forward. So as long as you explain quite clearly and think it through, even if you're just explaining the gaps more than anything else, that's fine. But it's just you need to spend a lot of time and effort on this aspect of the project design is really, I think, the summary here. Thanks.
Thank you, Emmanuel. We have another question about the baseline. Is it accepted that the baseline is developed internally with partners rather than by an external evaluator? Again, this will be assessed as long as it is in your product and it is clear the methodology that you'll be using or you intend to use to gather this baseline data. I don't see any issues for it to be gathered internally. But Emmanuel, if you can...
Exactly. I mean, the baseline, you're doing it at the beginning of implementation. The external evaluation really starts process-wise like much, much later. It's at the end of the project. So yes, baselines can be done, yes, absolutely, internally. Through the agencies, funds, and programs and partners that are already implicated in the project rather than waiting until the end, right? Because you're doing this at the beginning. So the collection needs to start right away.
Thank you very much. Are there any other questions or any other elements that you would like us to discuss in regards of monitoring and evaluation and creating your results frameworks?
I don't see any other questions, so I would say maybe we go ahead to the theory of change. Oh, there is one question. From Carlos, is that if there is not a baseline and needs to be developed within the project, is it okay?
Yeah, I mean, I can just quickly jump in. Yes, that's fine. I mean, try to, in the M&E framework, in the results framework that we're preparing, when you're looking at the, indicators that you're designing, sometimes you will have them, but then if they're not there yet, you're right, you put NA in the project document, but then you need to plan for collection immediately when the project starts for the areas where the baselines are missing. Another question, what could be done when national baselines are not available and when resources and time might not be enough to fetch data collection or flesh out data collection? No, you need to make the time and design and plan the resources for collection then start at the beginning of the project. So that's part of your project design, is where that the national baselines are not available and you don't have the data, you need to start collecting once the project implementation starts. That's one of the immediate M&E activities that you'll start like right away.
All right, thank you
So-
very much, Manat. Are there any other questions? Should we move along? All right. Well, thank you so much, Manuel, for the clarifications. And of course, we will have also another time by the end of the presentation for any further questions that may arise in terms of monitoring and evaluation, and of course, conflict analysis as well. Now, moving along, we want to talk right now about how one of the most important elements that we are using right now to evaluate the pertinence, the viability, the peace building approach into the new projects that we are evaluating today at PBF. Specifically for GYPI, we expect every single project to have a theory of change. This is quite an interesting topic in the sense that we definitely in the sector in general we interpret theories of change in a very different way. Today, I would like to explain to you how we understand theories of change within PBF, how we use theories of change to depict our peace building approach, and also how it is differentiated from our results framework or logic model. So our theory of change explains why an action is assumed to produce a certain change. Right? So we initially were talking about, defining our conflict analysis, meaning this is the context where we're working, right? Then we defined what are the changes that we're expecting. And now we want to ask ourselves, why do we think that by intervening these specific conflict factors, these specific elements within those societies that we want to intervene, why touching upon those will promote a behavioral institutional change, and why, right? Definitely, the theory of change will in the end explain why a change is expected to happen. Again, why a change is expected to happen, not how a change will happen, and not how I will do my activities for the change to happen. In that sense, if our theory of change is explaining the how, that is a theory of change that applies to a logic model. If the theory of change based on specific assumptions of our context and assumptions of ourselves is explaining why a change is going to happen because of our intervention, then we're talking about a theory of change that is based in a peace building approach. So the theories of change are basically developed at this stage, at the concept stage, right? Some of you in your concept notes already developed some theories of change, some very strong theories of change as well. Some others need to, be refined because they need to be differentiated between the logic model and the theory of change. Theories of change are explanatory. They address the why, as I was saying. They explain specifically the why a change is bound to happen or about to happen because of our intervention, whereas the logic model will address the how. The theory of change is based on an analysis or an examination of embedded assumptions that are usually backed up by evidence. Meaning, in the conflict analysis, we're saying this is a conflict driver that is in the society. This is the number of conflicts that we have seen in the past, 3 years. These are the consequences of this conflicts, right? But those facts are the ones that are going to are the evidence that will support in the end the reasons why we are explaining a change is bound to happen because of our intervention. On the other hand, the logic model or a results framework will tell us the step-by-step how by intervening this change might happen or not. Not the why, but the how. Again, the step-by-step on that process. And finally, Our theory of change can be either global, right? So global in terms of like the entire society will change, and mostly this types of theories of change are used for a higher level, more strategic way, not necessarily on the project level, but also they can be project specific, interpreted within a specific local context. And yet again, I want to repeat this and be super clear, and hopefully everybody's understanding the way that we understand the theories of change. So we, in our conflict analysis, have described the context, have described the conflict drivers, have this analyzed in a very comprehensive way and rigorous way what is happening in those contexts and what is my value added as organization to intervene in these specific conflict drivers to promote a behavioral or institutional change. My theory of change is telling me why by intervening this behavioral and institutional change will happen. Whereas my logic model will tell me the step-by-step on how my actions will build up into the desired change. They can benefit, of course, the theories of change, they can benefit from research, from studies, from fact-based conflict analysis, for sure. And they need to be provided with evidence. Again, at the conflict analysis, we have defined our context. We have defined fact-based reasons on why a conflict driver is important and why we have the expertise and why by intervening those those conflict drivers, then a certain change might happen, right? Yet again, it is very important, and the theory of change need to be based in a very solid conflict analysis, and they need to be intertwined and related amongst each other. We need, while drafting our theory of change, to make our assumptions explicit, to tell our audience, our reader, what we, by doing X, Y, Z, this will happen. Because in the past, for instance, the effects of intervening in this way gave that specific effect, that behavioral change. We need to make sure that we are making our assumptions explicit. Women and girls are not going to schools. By opening a school capacity, we can promote them going to school and solving XYZ barrier, for instance. These are very, simple examples that will help us understand a little bit better how to write down a theory of change. What we usually do on this side at PBF is think first about the assumptions that we're making, both the assumptions on the context, right? What are those conflict drivers that we want to address? What might be the effect of intervening those conflict drivers? And then understanding also what is my expertise as organization, what is my value added that I am bringing, and what is the past experiences that we have seen about intervening those conflict factors and what effects those interventions have had. For instance, we have had occasions where a theory of change is based on an assumption that by intervening a conflict factor, the effect, in a certain way, the effect was negative. Therefore, we need to change the way we're intervening so that the effect is positive, right? That is the way, by making clear those assumptions, that is the way that we write down our theory of change. We need to, like, the most beautiful thing I would say about theories of change is that we write them down to actually prove them while implementing our projects, right? So what we want to say is we defined, because we have the expertise, we defined to intervene a conflict driver in this way, right? While implementing, we're going to prove that this theory is correct, that our assumption is correct, or we're going to prove otherwise, the assumption was not correct, and the way that we were intervening is actually not giving a positive effect to a specific society, to a specific community. So let's learn from this experience and in the future intervene differently. But the most interesting thing about theories of change is that we are to prove them when implementing. So that's why it tries to explain why a desired change is bound to happen, and not the how the desired change is bound to happen. It should promote, of course, project effectiveness. It promotes increasing our knowledge and how fact-based we are analyzing the different contexts where we're operating. And as I was saying, since we are proving our theories of change while implementing our projects, we are improving, in the end, our decision-making processes for future programs. As I was saying, we need to make sure that our assumptions while drafting our theories of change are clear. So what we define usually is we defined initially our programmatic approach. So we defined our results, right? We want X, Y, and Z to happen in a specific society because we are intervening these A, B, and C conflict drivers. But also, when we define that programmatic approach, we need to make sure that we understand what are the assumptions related to that programmatic approach. Back to my example of women and girls not being able to go to school in a specific geography, we need to understand why is it that women and girls are not going to school, right? If it's only by augmenting schools' capacity that we will allow women and girls to go to school, or is there any other factor that we need to take into account and assume exists within that society that we need to address to promote this behavioral or institutional change? And those assumptions that we're making on our programmatic approaches need to definitely be supported by evidence. So we know, for instance, that 25% of women and girls present in our said geography are not going to school. That's a fact. That's an evidence that is supporting one of my assumptions. We have searched the perceptions of parents in this geography, and their perception is women and girls do not need to go to school. That's another evidence that is supporting another assumption, which is parents are not sending their women and girls to schools, right? So again, we take our programmatic approach, which is based in our results framework, then we analyze what assumptions are we making on the change that we're looking for, and then we support those assumptions with evidence. If we cannot support those assumptions with evidence, then the assumption, unfortunately, would not serve us well in the drafting of our theory of change. Finally, and this is something that is mostly like PBF related. Usually, theories of change are crafted in the if and then approach. This has been widely used. We understand that, but unfortunately, we feel that sometimes when using the if and then approach, the evidence that supports one, unfortunately, sometimes assumptions are not explicit, and two, the supporting evidence is not present when drafting our theory of change in this way. What we do usually at PBF is we define why a change is bound to happen, why our intervention is bound to happen, and then we make our assumptions explicit. I want to hand it over here to Joao.
Thanks, Alejandro. No, I just want to emphasize, so once again, looking at the theory of change, how to make sure that it's gender and youth responsive. The main aspect, I think, as mentioned by Shaza in the earlier parts of the presentation, the theory of change should clearly articulate the causal link. So the link chain, sorry. So it's not a gender empowerment project. It's not a youth empowerment project. It is gender empowerment or youth empowerment that is directly linked to peace building outcomes. So the TOC has to really articulate this causal link and explain how, by empowering women or by empowering young people or both, how you are contributing to peace building outcomes. The other aspect that's very important to avoid making assumptions on behalf of the beneficiaries of what you or your team think is meaningful change. Especially in this aspect, it's very important to really work in very close collaboration with the key stakeholders. And in this case, not only small elites or decision makers, but really try to include women and young people to ensure that the project outcomes really reflect the desired change. And last but not least, we know that there is a lot of concerns regarding the time. Sometimes it's just not feasible to really do a very participatory process. However, it is crucial in the context of the GYPI that at least there is a very consistent validation process that will make sure that women and youth do have the opportunity to shape the project proposal, and making sure that then the proposals are gender and youth responsive. Ilva, Shaza, did I forget anything?
Nothing from my side. Thank you so much, João.
Thank you, João. No, nothing.
So I'll hand over to, I think, Alejandro again.
Yes, thank you, João. So taking into account these important considerations that we need to have in terms of gender and youth in order to draft our theories of change, we wanted to share with you a little example, good or bad, an example of a theory of change that was crafted for a GM3 project, meaning a project that had a high gender marker in how we at PBF define gender sensitivity and gender in the projects that we receive, right? So the theory of change says the following: to improve Sudan's peace and political processes and contribute the acceptance of inclusivity, right? So our final outcome, our final change, desired change, is to improve Sudan's peace and political processes while contributing to the acceptance. This will happen because, on one hand, governments, representatives, emerging young women, and established women leaders are connected to one another in specific states, and because avenues of empowerment, feedback, and collaboration through intersectional trust building and dialogue between communities in those states is made broadly amplified, right? So again, what we're seeing in this theory of change is a desired change, improve Sudan's peace and political processes, to improve Sudan's peace and political processes, but because of what? Because of government representatives, being connected to one another, because of avenues of empowering, empowerment, feedback, and collaboration through intersectional is made broadly amplified. So the assumptions are clear in this theory of change. What assumptions are we talking about here? One, that the activities will increase the receptivity of male-dominated political processes to the added value of women and young women as they see the benefits of their increased participation in leadership. We are assuming that young men will be eager to engage with the project, and also young women, as the project has been designed to incorporate their interests and recognizing that they're both have experienced the violence and exclusion. The project assumes that its management team will be able to build on a strong, credible, and trustworthy relationship. The project assumes that some women and young men might be targeted for their inclusion in this project. And finally, the project assumes that it will capitalize on the public leadership that women have displayed in the revolution. Again, we have a desired change, why that desired change will happen, and we are making explicit what are the assumptions that led us to think that this theory is valid. And by the risk of being reiterative here, I want to make sure that we understand that the theory of change is to be proven by our implementation process. This being said, I want to move along to some questions that we might have in terms of the entire presentation, the three elements that we have seen today, conflict analysis, conflict sensitivity, monitoring and evaluation frameworks, and of course, the drafting of our theory of change. Do we have any?
Yeah, thank you so much, Alejandro. So we have one comment and one question so far. So first we have a comment from Shella saying that the focus is on women and youth and haven't heard much about the disabled population. And I guess to start off, just from my side, yes, we're focusing on women and youth since it's the GYPI, but of course, as we highlighted in the conflict analysis section and so on, it's very important to take into consideration the diversity within these groups and so on. Yes. But yes, so the reason why we're focusing on women and youth specifically is that it's the GYPI. But of course, we expect that the conflict analysis takes into consideration the diversity within these groups. Is there anyone else of the colleagues that have anything to add on this point?
I just wanted to, just elaborate on what you said. And we have seen projects within GYPI and others that do include and focus on disabled populations. So, absolutely. I mean, within the various groups, whether youth or women, we would definitely encourage that. Maybe we haven't touched upon this, but there are resources within the UN system on disability inclusion, and I think probably, I'm not sure about the programming side, but yeah, that would definitely add to the inclusion and the diversity aspect we're looking for.
Great, thank you so much, Shaza. Then there's a question saying, the explanation on the left column seems more like an explanation of how change happens than why. Alejandro, is this something you would like to talk more about, maybe?
Of course. Thank you so much for pointing that out, and it's great that you actually pointed out, because it means that there is a certain understanding or common understanding of how theories of change are drafted. Yes, there might be some overlaps on the how, right? But also it shows us as a matter of an example, it's showing us, what are the assumptions that we used to draft this theory of change. So I coincide with Erwin that they might be showing us somewhat the how the change is happening, and there might be a little bit of an overlap. What we wanted to do here was to show you how explicit things we are expecting to be particularly in the products that we're about to receive in this second stage of GYPI.
If I can just quickly jump in, because that is such an interesting point to discuss, right? And we're not going to sort of get to the end of it today. We just don't have enough time. Theory of change would require, a 3-day, a 1-week dedicated, workshop altogether, speaking live about it all day. But I think the point here, just again, coming from a very practical perspective and trying to reconcile, kind of good practice and guidance with, what can we, realistically do. The assumptions basically here. So what's on the left, you're right. I agree with Alejandro. It's and the person who made the comment. It's a little bit the how, but the assumptions, the way that the assumptions are articulated, point us to the direction of the why, right? So it's got good points. It's got strengths in that aspect, but it certainly isn't a perfect theory of change. So I think that's the way to think about it. Because if you're aiming directly for the perfect theory of change, that's kind of difficult to attain. But if you break it down into, okay, what do we want to make sure that is clear here? The assumptions, the set of assumptions is one thing. It's one tool to clarify your theory of change. So it'll help like compensate a little bit for any weakness in the way that you formulate it. So try to formulate it as well as possible, but you know what I mean, use tools and assumption, this articulating like the list of assumptions, even if it's a little bit long. I think you're encouraged to do that because it'll help the thinking process, and it'll help ultimately the pack understand the why, right? So you want to give the pack, the project appraisal committee, like all the tools that they can to really understand. And before that, you know, I'd really encourage you, there was one question earlier about what sections of the project document do you want us to submit for feedback. I'd encourage you to make sure that your theory of change is part of that, so you can get some feedback on it, because you don't want to, you know, kind of do it, submit it, and then your project is rejected because really the theory of change is too weak, because that can happen. Over.
Great, thank you so much, Emmanuel and Alejandro. That's very useful. We also have another question, which is a graphical representation of a theory of change encouraged? Would anyone like to jump in on this question?
I'd love to jump in on this one.
Okay, great, thank you.
Because I think, and colleagues do also come in, I think maybe that's not like a, you know, yes or no answer. It's kind of a, you know, again, like what's more practical. You know, the theory of change is such a challenging thing. You know, use a visual if you feel like that is gonna really explain something that you're struggling to explain in words, but don't use a visual. Let's say, okay, short answer, I would encourage you to focus on the narrative and the wording of it and articulating that clearly, and prioritize that rather than the diagram, because the diagram is often most useful to illustrate something that you're already able to articulate, right, in words, but it's just quicker with the visual. You just see it in one go instead of reading the whole thing, but you still need to, you know, you still need to be able to articulate it. So for me, the words will be more important, because if you have a good diagram but the articulation is not there in the narrative, it's not the picture is not going to help you. The picture is a support, so prioritize the narrative, I'd say.
Thank you so much for that, Emmanuel. That sounds great. Is there anyone else who would like to add anything to this? It doesn't seem like it. Okay, great. Let's see if there are any other questions. I don't see any other questions in the chat currently, but please feel free to add them still. From my colleagues here, is there anything you would like to add at this point, highlight further?
Yes, so, and thank you, Ilva. On the side of defining theories of change and crafting and sitting down and thinking about how we are looking forward for this desired change, we encourage you to please visit our website. We have a theory of change guidance note in English, Spanish, and French. It has been very useful. It has clear examples. It will tell you the step-by-step. And this presentation was actually based on that guidance note. So please feel free to visit our website. Also, on our screen here, we have some useful resources that you might want to use to give you the definition of gender markers, to give you the definition of theories of change. I wanted to add also to previous comments made by Emmanuel, and also having taken into account that we are in the second stage. That I want to make sure that you understand that the reason why your concept notes made it to this stage is because either there was a very solid conflict analysis, or because there was a very solid results framework, sometimes theories of change that made a case for a good project for us to invest in. So all I want to say is you're not starting from scratch. You have very good resources to work with. And please reach out if you have any questions or any more suggestions on how we can guide you better into drafting this project documents for the next stage. So I think we have a, yes, Shasa?
No, I just wanted to point out we have two more questions, one in Spanish, but also in terms of resources, please also go back to the other webinars that we've done, for example, the thematic webinars. In the chat box, I've shared links to there are some really good non-UN guidance out there on gender responsive conflict analysis. I've shared the link in the chat, so please look at them, in addition to the other webinars we've done for this year.
Great, thank you so much. In terms of the question in Spanish, may I hand over to Alejandro Joao, perhaps?
Of course, and thank you, Paola, for the question. The question is, the direct beneficiaries of a project are 90 women, but because of the domino effect that the project had, their families were also benefited from the project. The question is, if when we're characterizing this population, should we also include families that for the domino effect were also included? Usually, Paola, we considered families in this case as secondary beneficiaries or external beneficiaries. Thank you, Emmanuel. Indirect beneficiaries, whereas the initial 90 women who were benefited by the project are direct beneficiaries.
Great, thank you so much, Alejandro. Then there's one more question. What would be the place of creativity in the theory of change if the theory of change should be based strongly on evidence, creativity or innovation? Would anyone like to add anything on this?
Of course. Well, theories of change can be very innovative and very creative in the sense that we're to prove a theory by implementing a project, right? In that sense, this theory might be based in assumptions that are evidence-based, right? In things that you have perceived, read, analyzed from the society that you're about to work with. But also you can say, me as an organization, I want to define a new way of intervening a specific conflict driver, and I want to potentially see the effects that this intervention might have in this specific conflict driver in the future and prove that through implementing this project, right? So innovation might come, or creativity might come not necessarily from the evidence base, but from your knowledge of the context, from your added value as an organization that has worked or has experienced in specific elements within that context to address specific conflict drivers that will promote that behavioral and institutional change. So yes, there's a lot of space for creativity. We encourage you to be innovative. I think this is something that we've been insisting in since the very beginning of the call for proposals. And when presenting GYPI, we definitely think that innovation, creativity is definitely one of your greatest assets when presenting this proposals to PBF.
Can I jump in really quickly? I mean, on two things. First of all, yeah, to piggyback on what Alejandro was saying, and really we can't stress enough. I mean, the innovation is the core of the GYPI. I mean, if gender and youth are kind of the framework, and the innovation is really what we're looking for. So absolutely, there's no contradiction between innovation and an evidence-based theory of change. Make your project, based on your analysis, make your proposed interventions as innovative as possible. This is a new way of addressing these conflict factors. This is a new way of doing things. We've never tried this before. This is the project where we're going to try it. Go for that 150%. This is really the core objective here. And then, try to, explain in your theory of change why you think this new approach is going to help. Basically, and the simplest way to put it is this: the theory of change, you say, this is why we think, the change is going to happen through these interventions. And then if you're not sure, just submit it in as a draft, and we'll give you feedback on the theory of change. But don't be held back by the idea that, oh my God, I won't have enough evidence for the theory of change. Like that's really not. Don't do that. You know, the value of your project will be in the innovation, and then we'll help you better formulate the theory of change if necessary. I would like to go back to an earlier question in the during the session, which was on indigenous mediation and conflict resolution mechanisms. And I want to invite colleagues, you know, who are in the room who might have experience on this to maybe share anything that you want to share in the chat, sort of a recommendation on how to approach this, an experience on how you've done maybe before through your various organizations or in another PBF project, kind of a project that has a focus on strengthening or amplifying, you know, or making some of these, you know, traditional or indigenous, mediation processes more inclusive, more effective, scaling them up, something like that. Do share, because I think that was a very useful question. And if you have anything on the mental health and psychosocial support aspect, also do share. I mean, I feel, you know, as you know, this is the first year that in the GYPI we include a mental health and psychosocial support focus. Many of you submitted proposals that made it through the first round with a strong mental health and psychosocial support component. So this is really something that we're looking into and looking forward to. So do share experiences there too, if you have in the chat. And if you have any other questions or comments on this before we finish this session today.
Great, thank you so much, Emmanuel. Yes, let's see if we get more comments on this. There's also a comment on innovation. So Andrea, I think, is saying, if we go for something that was never tried, we may also be penalized compared to approaches that's been working and it's already backed by evidence. I have a feeling colleagues will have some input on this. Feel free to go ahead.
Yes. So I would absolutely enthusiastically respond. Again, you will not be penalized. You will get extra points for proposing something that hasn't been done before. You know, I cannot stress this enough, that the project appraisal committee will say, oh my goodness, we've never tried this before. You're getting extra points for that. You will not be penalized. It's the reverse. You know, this is what we're looking for in the proposals. And, you know, when in the first round of selection, the proposals that came up with things that have been done before, you know, are not, you know, many of them didn't make it because of that, right? The proposals that made it had strong elements, strong potential, strong basis on the conflict analysis, but most of the ones that made it, we sensed, or the PAC sensed, you know, a potential for innovation, for trying something new here. So I cannot stress that enough. And if you have any other questions on this, feel free to write to the GYPI address and say, you know, really anything else on this, write to us and we'll respond. But prioritize innovation, prioritize trying something new, please. Over.
Perfect, thank you so much. And then we have a couple of last questions in Spanish. Yes, please go ahead, Alejandro.
Yes, I wanted to answer these questions, and thank you, Carlos and Silvia, for adding up to these questions. The questions are basically in terms of the theory of change guidance that we have online that was sent by us. I think initially in Spanish and English. We also have a French version that has come out recently. How much should we use, you know, the format that is used in the guidance note? To the letter, no, to specifically use that format. I would say both the format is useful. So the little tables that we have there, those are useful for you to understand both your programmatic approaches vis-a-vis your assumptions, vis-a-vis your evidence. But what we want to see, though, in the product is the theory of change in and of itself, and maybe a summary of those assumptions, but not necessarily every single detail that you can put into that table that is described in the guidance note. So I would say yes, the drafting, the writing will change, And you can, of course, use that as a resource to create a better, more understandable theory of change, and also to understand your own assumptions, depending on the context and depending on your specific assumptions that you're depicting for your theory of change.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Alejandro. Then we also have a question regarding budget. The question is, how flexible is the 40% allocation to CSOs? Can funding be allocated directly to beneficiaries, individuals? Could this be categorized under the CSO percentage? Colleagues, feel free to add. My 10 cents is that the funding should go to CSO, so that's a strict requirement. Emmanuel, do you have anything more to add there in terms of funding to individuals and so on?
Yes, so the requirement is a minimum 40% goes to the CSO. So the flexibility does not go downward, it goes upward. Now, if there's going to be a section where you have some cash to beneficiaries, you know, the way that you count it is what is the recipient, like who's going to distribute the cash to the beneficiaries, like through what activity. So it's not like just we're giving cash, right? It's part of a section of the, you know, the outputs. It's a form of activity, right? So if this cash distribution through a cash for work activity meant to, you know, to rehabilitate a given structure, for example, by, you know, or a grant or micro grants mechanism, who is doing the activity? Is it the agency, or is it the partner, the CSO implementing partner, right? So it depends who will be handling the cash. So if it's the implementing CSO partner that will eventually be giving very small cash amounts as part of that micro grant activity, then that's a CSO portion. If it's the UN agency undertaking that activity, it's a UN agency portion. Do you know what I mean? So it depends on who is implementing the activity, right? The cash is part of an activity. So depending on who is implementing the activity, that's where you count it. I hope that makes sense. But usually those cash are going to be small amounts of the budget, right? It's very rare that we're going to see a budget where there's a lot of cash that's being like handed out to beneficiaries. So it's most likely going to be a fairly small part of the budget anyway.
Great, thank you so much. We also received a question on if it's possible to submit also budgets for early review on the 17th or narrative only. My answer would be that feel free to submit both. In terms of feedback, we will focus on the narrative. Emmanuel, would you have anything else to add there?
I agree with your response, Ilva. Do send both. I mean, the more advanced your package is, the better for you. And you'll have the opportunity to receive feedback on both. But of course, the budget are a reflection of a well-constructed narrative, right? So we first start with a narrative, and then the budget needs to be aligned with that. But you'll get feedback on both. Submit as much as you can. There was one quick comment earlier to say innovation is not always positive. Just to reflect on that, you know, that's absolutely true. And I think that's where the balance is, where we want you to do something innovative. Absolutely, that's the core goal, but it shouldn't be random. It shouldn't be, oh, you know, let's just try that randomly. And that's where we go back to the theory of change and the importance of thinking it through. So where you can find evidence, you use evidence. This is new, but we think it's going to work because we know that we've done something that had one aspect of this before, not the full aspect, but one part. And so, or because we know, you know, we did a study and we noticed that it's most effective to do a, you know, reintegration activity when the younger members of the people to be reintegrated have been part and parcel of the consultation process. So it's a balance to find. We want innovation, but it shouldn't be random, right? We should get a sense that it's going to be good. So we should convince us that it's going to be good innovation, of course. So just on that point.
Great, thank you so much, Emmanuel. There are two questions in Spanish, and then there's also one question in French, if any of the colleagues would like to take over for a bit.
Yeah, I will take on the Spanish questions. Byron Cardenas asks if formulating the theory of change must always be under the if-then equation. Sorry. Byron, we at PBF we tend to separate a little bit from the if and then equation because it sometimes is not entirely based in assumptions that are fact-based as well, that are evidence-based. So no, the answer to your question is no, we don't always use the equation if then. If you want to use it, please feel free to, but also make sure that you include the assumptions and that those are clearly depicted, clearly expressed by your if-then equation there. The second question by Luisa Fernanda Betancourt is if within the activities of our projects we have planned doing some advocacy work, is there any recommendation for indicators, having taken into account that these actions are not necessarily, are very difficult to measure? I would say yes. There are many different types of indicators that you can use to measure advocacy actions. Don't feel constrained by the fact that we need to measure things, but maybe we can work together and propose new types of indicators to actually measure these elements.
I would love to jump in here as well on the advocacy question because it's a good one. I would caution that we're often not very excited to fund advocacy because, you know, unless it's very specific and it's in and of itself a way to maybe increase inclusion of certain people. So if you're going to be doing advocacy work by sort of members of like grassroots civil society organizations, help them strengthen their ability to advocate, help expand or scale up their advocacy, that's one thing that's good because in the process you're empowering and you're doing inclusion work and etc. If it's, you know, advocacy by ensuring that it's, you know, young people or young women from a certain community that are enabled to do that, that's one thing. If you're going to do advocacy as in the UN, you know, agency, country office is going to be, you know, doing advocacy, that's not something that we usually support. And we look upon that quite negatively because for us, that's part of regular programming. I mean, if you're UN Women and you want to do advocacy about women's rights, that's your regular programming. That's part and parcel of your objective. So there's no value added for the PBF to come in and fund that type of advocacy work. So just a caveat, be very careful. And so if you're going to be doing advocacy activities that are basically a means to do something else, to do empowerment, to do inclusion of, you know, targets, beneficiaries that are relevant to your conflict analysis, then your indicators become a little bit more obvious, right? Because what you're measuring is the empowerment. What you're measuring is, you know, the increased capacities, the increase, then the ability of, you know, people who have never done that before, you know, local journalists or local human rights activists, their ability to have connections and collaborations and able to speak to, you know, national level authorities or provincial level authorities. So you're measuring that improved capacities, that empowerment, rather than just like advocacy in general.
Great, thank you so much, Emmanuel. May I also ask if you want to have a look at the question in French, perhaps?
Yeah, so the question in French is, you know, how does the distribution of costs, you know, work if there's two civil society organizations that are submitting a project? So first of all, for the GYPI, we're only having one CSO at most, right? So you know, it's only going to be for this GYPI one CSO at a time. Are you talking about implementing partners? If you're talking about implementing partners, you go back to the activity base, right? Who's doing the activity? Who's implementing the activity? And that's, you know, that's how the budget is distributed. But let me know if that's not clear. And if really it's not clear, you send the question to the GYPI email address, please.
Great, thank you so much. There's also a question of whether we accept assumptions related to the COVID pandemic.
Absolutely.
Yes, absolutely. Go ahead, Emmanuel, please.
Yeah, no, I mean, absolutely, we do. Just explain the relationship. I mean, the way that we've seen, points related to COVID here from a peace building angle is the extent to which that may have exacerbated certain conflict dynamics, certain conflict factors, and at times created new ones. But we've really seen more the effect of COVID-19, whether it's the virus itself, the pandemic itself, or the restrictions related to it, as exacerbators, amplifiers of conflict dynamics that existed already. So absolutely, do use that. Yeah.
Great, thank you so much. And then there's also a question, how should the government endorsement of the project be presented in the proposal? And a question if a signed letter should be included or not. So this is already added in the pro-doc. There's already a space for signatures. So please use that. Emmanuel, would you have anything else to add on that?
Yeah, I mean, it's so crucial. Depending on context, this can be a sensitive question. Long story short, the project is only approved if the government has signed it. So get the government signature. If you want a letter or anything, sometimes a letter of commitment, at the draft stage is your way to make sure that when it's time to sign the project, the government will do so. So use the tools that you need, but know that at the end, we require a government signature. I hope that's helpful. We don't need anything else than the government signature, but if anything would be helpful in you getting that, do that.
Great, thank you so much. And then we have a question regarding the deadline for the draft proposals. The question is if they can submit on another day, and unfortunately that's not possible. So in order to be as fair and as transparent as possible, the deadline is the 17th of September for everyone, and then feedback will be provided about 2 weeks after. And that's the one opportunity for feedback. So I encourage you all to use it. And also please remember that you received feedback in the feedback sheets from the first pack. So please take a look at that also and develop your projects accordingly. Okay, great. I think that's all the questions for now. I would like to thank all of the colleagues and everyone who joined us here today. Thank you so much. We will share the slides and the recordings, etc., etc. And we wish you good luck with your development of the projects. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Have a good day.
Thank you, colleagues, and good luck. Bye.
Good luck. Thank you very much, everybody.